Welcome everybody to Africa Talks, to edition number 21. And I might say it is a special edition on a day where we have, I might say this, a historical agreement on nature conservation at the World Nature Conference COP15 in Montreal. I'm more than delighted to introduce my co-host of this show from Namibia, Ingelor Katjingisua. Good to have you in the show, Ingelor.
Thank you, Marco. I'm Ingelor Katjingisua, and I'm looking forward to co-hosting Africa Talks and discussing African and European topics with alumni of the International Journalists Network, IJP, and our distinguished guests.
Yes, as you said, Africa Talks is designed as a digital platform for the exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. I'm Marco Vollmer. I'm a member of the board of the IJP programs, and I'm looking forward to this edition.
Yes. As Marco said, our topic could not be more newsworthy today. The topic is the coming Montreal Declaration. World Nature Conference COP15 agrees on protecting biodiversity sustainably. After around 2 weeks of negotiations, the 5,000 participants at the UN World Summit on Nature in Montreal, Canada, have agreed on a final declaration. In the agreement, coming Montreal, the 193 countries set themselves the goal of protecting at least 30% of the world's land and marine areas by 2030. In addition, more money is to be spent on protecting biodiversity. Among other things, richer countries are to donate about $20 billion a year to poorer countries by 2025. This means that key goals of the UN Biodiversity Conference have been met. The agreement aims to protect the land, oceans, and animals from pollution, decay, and the climate crisis. Of the estimated 8 million animals and plant species on Earth, 1 million are threatened with extinction, according to the scientists of the World Biodiversity Council, IBPES.
IBPES, exactly. And after the adoption, if I'm not wrong, loud cheers erupted at the plenary session at the Montreal Convention Center. I wasn't there, but I read about it, which had been repeatedly pushed back in times before. Organizers, scientists, and representatives of non-governmental organizations had hoped until the very end that the landmark global agreement for species protection could still be adopted at the meeting. Is this the breakthrough we have waited for? How do African countries see the declaration? What does it mean for the countries of the global north? Where are the greatest opportunities and where are the greatest obstacles? And can the protection of biodiversity be financed sustainably now?
These and other questions we would like to discuss with our distinguished guests. Simangele Msweli is a conservationist with an interest and experience in research, community engagement, and policy development. At the Africa Wildlife Foundation, she serves as a senior manager of the Youth Leadership Program, where she oversees AWF's Engaging Youth Program. She actively works with the policy experts across Africa, China, Europe, and North America to develop the next generation of leaders that understand the importance of conservation and can be African voices that bring about change. She currently supports the policy working group of the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance, a group of 100+ CSOs that work together to influence biodiversity policies. She is also responsible for developing and implementing bespoke leadership programs like the Charles Wall Young African Policy Fellows Program. She's determined to unlock professional opportunities for youth and strengthen African youth engagement in the CBD. Simangele, good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have to add that you are still in Montreal, so you are really on spot, and you can give us some, I think, some real-time reactions maybe later on. Our second guest is also a well-known expert on biodiversity from Germany. Josef Settele works at the UFZ, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Halle, Germany. It's in the eastern part of Germany, where he heads the Department of Conservation Biology and Social-Ecological Systems. He holds a PhD in agriculture based on agroecological research on biocontrol in tropical irrigated rice systems and is professor of ecology at the Martin Luther University of Halle-Wittenberg. He has extensive science policy experience, e.g. as co-chair of the Global Assessment of IPBES from 2016 to 2019, and as coordinating lead author of the 5th assessment report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. He also is co-author of the IPBES IPCC co-sponsored workshop report on biodiversity and climate change, published in 2021. And this is also important. Since July 2020, he is a member of the German Advisory Council of the Environment of the German government. Mr. Settele, we are very honored to have you here at Africa Talks on our show.
Thank you very much for these nice words. I also feel very honored to be host in your meeting here. Looking forward to that.
Okay, let's jump into Africa Talks. Simangele, you were at the CBD COP15 in Montreal, and you're still here. You're still there now. Could you please share with us the moment when the declaration was approved?
Thank you so much. It actually was just approved around 3 a.m. this morning. So hardly, just less than 5 hours ago, actually. I will say for me, it was a good moment. One of our colleagues usually says, in negotiations, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate for. And also you go there understanding that it's compromises. So you are not always going to get the pure original version of what you wanted. So on my side, I do think the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework actually had a balance to a large extent of the issues that were relevant for Africa, as well as issues that were relevant for other regions. So it was a good moment. But for those who probably watched online, you may have seen that some African countries, even though it was adopted, did take the floor to say they were still not happy. So yes, it was a version that I think is acceptable. But of course, you still do have countries that were not totally happy with it.
Josef, what is your impression, or what is your first feeling? Feelings and science usually doesn't correspond, but like, what are your thoughts? You also have been in Montreal, but already headed back to Germany. Did you expect that agreement?
Well, first of all, I would say that scientists also have feelings, of course. So that kind of, let's say, you have some kind of enthusiasm for the things you're doing. So you feel a bit, besides all the kind of, let's say, naked facts and figures. Well, I enjoyed staying in Montreal, which was a kind of, let's say, I was there for 1 week, and it was really business as usual, I would say, but the atmosphere was a bit different. It was kind of, let's say, very constructive. That's how I felt, at least. And it was very hard to keep the overview. Maybe that's normal, but there was so much going on, the main negotiations, the side events, all these things, which made me kind of optimistic first. Then I followed the negotiations. Then there was some kind of, let's say, depressive stage sometime last week. But it's always the same. You start with optimism, you get depressive, you kind of, things are blocked. And in the end, to come to a conclusion, it's always the same. I would say the conclusion was, it was open until early this morning in Montreal, and I was surprised in the end that this was the outcome. I thought there might be less, let's say, ambition. There's still a lot of space for ambition, of course, depends on the perspective you look at it. But I was quite positively surprised about the result. So I thought it was a good process. And of course, I never had expected to finish the whole thing in time. That's something very exceptional. That's really amazing.
Yes, it was also impressive to see that it was also signed this morning. Seeing that agent policy action is one of the tools to stabilize biodiversity loss in the next 10 years, what would you both consider to be primary policy interventions needed in African countries to achieve this? Let's start with your thoughts on this, Josef.
So as I have no big experience in Africa, I can just say more general what I would expect or what I think is important. But I think for global relevance, one important component is let's say, the change in the subsidy system we have, which was agreed also here. We have lots of, let's say, very perverse subsidies, which hardly, let's say, are positive for our globe. So we subsidize certain kinds of energy, which causes more problems than the money we put into it. It's a kind of, let's say, very negative thing. And I think here we made a good movement in the direction of, let's say, getting rid of this, at least step by step, get rid of this kind of subsidies. That's one important component. Another one, which I always liked from my background, also from Southeast Asia, I lived there for some time, so South Africa, but Southeast Asia, is the, let's say, inclusion of local communities, indigenous peoples, which is quite important. I think it's something which is now really accepted all across the CBD, which was the same across IPES before. It was a kind of progress we made in the last, let's say, half a decade, I think, which really moves towards this kind of inclusiveness, which I think is a core for all the solutions we're looking for. It's about local people and people living in places where the biodiversity is situated. That's in Africa, that's in Southeast Asia, it's also in Central Europe. So I think these are two very important components for me.
Mm-hmm. And what are your thoughts on these policy interventions needed in Africa to stabilize biodiversity, Simangele?
I mean, I'll start by building on what Joseph said. You have the area-based conservation targets that is famously known as 30 by 30. For me, it was great to see that in that target, you actually have text that says you need to ensure respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. This, I consider this as an improvement as opposed to the older version of the target, because you had quite a similar target in the IJP framework, but it only spoke on the side of protected areas and OECMs being effectively managed and so on. So I consider it quite an improvement that this target actually now recognizes the rights of IPLCs, but linked to that, it says also recognizing the indigenous and traditional territories where applicable, because they do contribute in conservation. So just to affirm that, I think this is a great step, recognizing that, especially in Africa, the model of area-based conservation, protected areas in nature had always came with a lot of human rights violations, evictions of people, and so on. So to actually have it in the text, it's something that is very transformative that I would love to see it translated to the ground action. But another thing I will touch on is, I think there's wide recognition that businesses, especially big businesses, have a very huge impact on the environment. We didn't have a target in the past framework around addressing this. So it's very important, although a bit weak, it is very important that we actually have a target that says there must be a legal, administrative, and other approaches to ensure that businesses can assess, monitor, and report on their impact on biodiversity, but it also encourages them to have their impacts on biodiversity. Now, the last one that I'm going to touch on, which I'm happy to hear what Joseph thinks, was a bit weaker on my side, but was transformative because it was not there at all in the old framework, is that we started seeing global consumption patterns with an interest of addressing them and so on, because they are one of the major indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So I'll say for me, those three elements are very major, and especially for Africa, where, we host a lot of big businesses that are not necessarily owned from Africa, but from the outside. So creating this policy environment and provisions for businesses to be able to measure and report on their impact is of course, one of the very transformational things. Thanks.
Would you directly answer to that, Joseph, what Simangele asked you?
Well, I think you're completely right. Well, we, let's say, elaborated in the global assessment, of course, about the direct indirect drivers, which is the kind of core element of the entire CBD negotiations. And the indirect ones are all quite important because they drive the direct drivers, indirect drivers driving the direct drivers. And I think the consumption patterns are surely a key thing locally as well as internationally. So if you look at which impact we as Europeans have on the globe in terms of consumption, it's, let's say, extremely negative now. I mean, we cause a lot of environmental problems elsewhere while keeping our, let's say, our own homeland kind of, let's say, nice and beautiful and safe. Well, a bit exaggerated, but something like this. So I guess consumption patterns are important, and we have to see ways how we are less, let's say, dependent on sources or resources which are needed elsewhere, which in the moment we are consuming in Central Europe, in the global north actually as a total. So for example, our meat consumption is kind of beyond anything which is reasonable. And that's something which causes lots of areas where you grow crops, or let's say fodder actually, for cattle. which you can also use for producing food, of course, which is the case even if in Germany, but also in Europe, and of course across the globe. I guess that's one very important component. And this consumption pattern is, I think, the main driver also in terms of demography, in terms of population growth. It's not about the number of people. It's also about the number of people, but it's mainly about how many resources do single persons use. And if you take this, the global north is, let's say, far beyond anything which is reasonable. And I think this is the major problem we have to solve. And that's something which is also related to the global development of populations, but it's a core component. So the qualifier in terms of what does it mean, population? It's not only about people, it's also about how people behave. So I think that's a very important thing, and that's something I really found it very good. It's in there. And also the business parts, as Simangele said, it's kind of moving in the right direction, let's put it like this. No? So at least they're in here now. It's still weakish somewhere, that's right. But at least they're explicitly mentioned. And if I think back of Montreal last week, I found it quite amazing how many business people have been there in the meeting. So it was quite a very good sign, actually, of this kind of, let's say, interest, activity, engagement, responsibility. I think all of this is a good sign in the right direction, I would say.
I would say the stone is rolling in this direction now. Thank God that we are on our way now, then that parts of the business community have understood. Considering the target of protecting 30%, the 30-30-30 target, of all marine and all terrestrial areas by 2030, the delegates have agreed to meet this target right now. Is this historical from your point of view, and would it really make a difference now? First question to Josef, and then to Simangele also.
Well, I would say it was a step I could hardly imagine 5 years ago. We talk about 30% conservation areas. Most people would have said you're kind of dreaming. No, that's something which never happened. That's maybe less than a decade ago. So I think it's moving in the right direction again. And I would say in the end, it depends, of course, on how you define this 30 times 30, this kind of conservation areas. We have this kind of, in Europe, oftentimes we have this kind of impression, 30% of conservation means this kind of fence, and you have kind of, let's say, wilderness there and nothing else. But if I look back at our own country, we have 0.6% of the area in Germany, which is wilderness. All the rest is somehow used. And all our conservation areas so far are also, let's say, used to different kind of land use systems, traditional systems, very old systems partly, which to quite some extent have created a biodiversity which is kind of unique. And I think this thinking has to be also, let's say, revitalized also in Europe, that conservation doesn't mean things are left alone. It's just nature on its own. It's hard. It's even more so that we might have maybe more areas which are used by people. And also in tropical areas, there's hardly any region which is without people. No, people are everywhere. So I have the IPLC, the indigenous people, local community kind of component, which I also apply in Europe. So if you talk about local communities, we always tend to think about the global south. But we also have these, of course, these local communities which manage their land for a long time and do it sustainably and have some kind of, let's say, function in the evolution of biodiversity, which we are trying to preserve. So I guess this 30 times 30 moves in the right direction. And in the end, it depends on how you really translate it on the ground. And that's something which cannot be solved on a global level, because managing, let's say, the Kalahari, managing Amazon and managing Central Europe is so different. It's very hard to make a general kind of, let's say, statement how you can do this. So some people say this was a kind of, let's say, not enough ambition. I would say it's very realistic. Do it like this. Otherwise, you have no chance to really find solutions.
Simangele?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add into that and say it's an interesting target. So around February last year, colleagues, myself, David Obura, and about more than 10 other conservationists from the African CSO's Biodiversity Alliance, we published this paper in the Science magazine, where we were basically encouraging people that conservation happens on the ground, right? Not at a global level. You can have a global target, but what's going to make that target is what's happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. And that traditionally, when we speak of protected areas and OECMs, we've been looking at pristine areas. But you have a lot of what we call shared spaces, areas where there's agricultural activities and there's potential for conservation there. Areas, as Joseph has mentioned, where you have indigenous peoples and local communities and so on. But the point we're trying to drive was that in looking at area-based conservation, we need to start thinking beyond this traditional model of protected areas and actually looking at how in these shared spaces that have people and some activities, how do we start to have sustainable or effective management practices there? So again, in agreement, it does rely on your interpretation of it. I do think it is an okay target as long as we do not box it into this traditional idea of protected areas, for instance. And I think for us, this is why one of the major points we're advocating for as African CSOs was that that target must recognize the rights of IPLCs, because we were having this learned or lived experience, right? That usually, even though the past targets actually had OECMs as well, which are not your traditional protected areas, but a lot of financial resources went to the segment of protected areas. So you are having these other conservation areas that IPLCs are leading, but they are not getting access to resources because they don't fall into the traditional model. So in agreement with Joseph, it is a good an interesting target. I'll say good to some extent. It's great that it recognizes the rights of IPLCs, but in implementing it, I really hope we will go beyond just thinking about the traditional protected areas, but we will look at the shared spaces where people are, but there's conservation potential, and see what kind of practices and management measures we put in place to ensure that these places as well continue to play a very significant role in conservation.
Ingelo, allow me one additional question, if you don't mind. Yeah. I would like to ask another question on the second goal of these discussions and these debates we have seen in the last 2 weeks, namely what already is mentioned here by our distinguished panelists, the question and the point of the indigenous communities, to listen more to them, to save their rights and to save their voices. What is achieved on this goal, on this objective? Simangele, maybe you start.
So I would say, so one of the things that end up happening is, so for me, if I compare this framework and these goals to the past ones, of course, these ones are better because they have this growing element of, to some extent, even though not mentioning it explicitly, but they recognize the human rights-based approach to conservation, but also they come at the time where the EPBEST has done the values assessment, where you've had your local global biodiversity outlook. So it's coming at the point where people are starting to appreciate, and science is also affirming, that indigenous peoples and local communities have a role to play, even having stats that are estimating that about 80% of remaining biodiversity is in areas that are either inhabited or managed or owned by indigenous peoples and local communities. So if you compare this framework to the old one, I would say, yes, that goal is transformative. We are moving to the right stage. But again, there's a question of not comparing it to the past ones and looking at it on itself and saying, is it enough to bend the curve? Yeah, it's better than before, but there still could have been stronger, right? Because a lot of language is around recognizing, it could have been stronger. But I would say, compared to where we come from, it does go a long way in affirming the role that IPLCs play in conservation. Yeah.
Josef?
Yeah, I think, well, if you just look at this target 3, which is about this 30 times 30 thing, the quote is ensuring that any sustainable use is there where appropriate in such areas. So appropriate is, of course, a kind of, let's say, weakening a bit, is fully consistent with conservation outcomes, recognizing and respecting. So that's, I think, both words are important. The rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, including over their traditional territories. That's a kind of quote from target 3. I would say, it gives some, of course, it's always a bit vague. That's always like in these negotiations, but it really is a much stronger statement than ever before in this direction. And in the end, of course, well, What would be your kind of desired formulation, Simangele, in this case? What would you write instead of, let's say, recognizing, respecting? What would be the right word for your point of view?
Yeah, so there had been a language prior that was in brackets on protecting the rights and so on. So I would say that language is one I would have preferred instead of just recognizing. But I can live with recognizing for now.
Yeah, no. Simangele, talking about implementation, what are the next steps now? How about hopes and fears surrounding these global summits? And how has Africa made its voice heard at the CBD COP? Yeah, just some of the forward thinking now. Oh.
I mean, I'll start by really commending the Africa group, the African group of negotiators. They came out more united than ever before. A lot of pre-work was done. But I would say going forward, for me, the main thing immediately, revise NBSAPs. Revise NBSAPs. We had an unfortunate situation in the last framework where you had a framework and then you lose a lot of years before you revise NBSAPs. So by the time it was already 2015 with 5 years left to implement, you right? So the implementation actually ended up not being the decade. Here we are even more at a disadvantage because we've already lost 2 years due to the COVID pandemic, which delayed the adoption of this framework, which we should have started implementing already. So it ends in 2030, so it's no longer a decade long. We are already, I'm not counting 2022, so I'll say the very immediate step is revise NBSAPs and make sure that those NBSAPs, when you revise them, the whole of society is engaged. By that, I mean all stakeholders are engaged. We don't want the repeat of the last framework where the NBSAP becomes a document that just belongs to the Ministry of Environment. It needs to be a document that all the other departments in the country are very much aligned and aware of, and they contributed into making it a reality. It is a document where IPLCs, where women, youth, and all other groups need to be effectively engaged to make sure that whatever the country is committing to is actually in line with national priorities, but also to ensure that you garner support from all these groups to play a role in implementation. So I'll say that is the first main step, and linked to that, a lot of us have a responsibility to then go back to the continent, to our homes, and communicate what is in these 4 goals and 23 targets.
Any thoughts, Joseph, from your side?
Just maybe first, NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, just as people don't know this abbreviation, maybe it's helpful. I also learned it in Montreal once again. You kind of, let's say, accustomed to all this kind of, let's say, acronyms, which is kind of tricky. And this also tells you it's about the national implementation of things, of course, in the end. Yeah. And I think this framework gives you also all the freedom, I would say, and all the background and all the backing needed to do this in a kind of appropriate way. That's all I want to say to this one. But I think it's an important component, and that holds true for all the countries on the globe.
And perhaps, Ingelo, I can add another thing that I think is very important. So one of the things that have been largely cited is the reason why the previous framework was not as achievable as it could have been was the lack of resources, specifically financial resources. And actually one of the biggest delays why there was a reason to stay until the morning was this question of resource mobilization. Where is the money is going to come from? By which mechanism is it going to be dispersed to where it needs to be going? And are we also going to have the system where it continues to just be directed at governments? What are we putting into place to ensure that other actors other than government have access to these resources? So I think for Africa, that's another very important point and a step to look to that it's actualized. I know Africa did not get the ultimate of what it wanted, which was the Global Biodiversity Fund, because we now ended up with, we're going to have in this period the GBF Trust Fund while the Global Biodiversity Fund is being built. So that's one of the very big things to be solved. And I would say consciously, though, that it's one of the Africa preferred different. Yeah, it was not a wow decision for Africa. It's not what they wanted. What they came home having promised the continent that we need and that they will fight for was a global biodiversity fund. But the current decision speaks of having a trust fund in the meantime while your global biodiversity fund is being built, but just emphasizing that all the ambition we make, the promises, the targets, they take resources to implement, and there's really need to ensure that these are adequate, are consistent, predictable, and more importantly, are also available for local actors on the ground. They don't end up only with big actors who have, yes, a very big role to play in conservation, but also local organizations are playing a lot of work in the front lines and tend to not usually have access to resources as compared to the other big players. Thanks.
I would like to add on the question on like have the African voices been heard on the conference, and would like to ask Josef, these kind of UN global summits, so to say, it's all about alliances, about groups and people gathering to make decisions possible. What was your feeling here? Did they have was it the same as always? And or what would you? How would you estimate this question and this game of alliances and of majority findings?
Well, it's very hard for me to compare. So if I take the other events like the IPBES COP, which was mainly about the IPBES document, the global assessment, where I was co-chair, I was always in the room, of course, as co-chair of the entire process. So I get much more insights than here, where I was just member of the IPBES delegation, had some, went to some meetings here and there. But having these disclaimers, I would say the atmosphere was quite open-minded. This was my impression, at least. And of course, you have some, let's say, people who really make a difference. So Simangele, you mentioned David Obura. He surely makes a difference because he's the way he's presenting things, the way he's arguing, he's always calm, always to the point, always scientific, but also very engaged, all these kind of combinations, which are ideal for such a setting. So people like him are those people you listen to in science as well as in the delegations, is my impression. So if we have more of these, I think it's getting better. We have more of this in the CBD context nowadays than we had before. It was my feeling, at least. So I guess there was more trust, but also it was difficult. But always you have this kind of negotiating teams, this kind of, let's say, networks, but they're all flexible somehow. They change in between different topics. So somebody is in one group for one topic, but in another group for the other topic. And I think that's quite natural. That's quite okay. As long as they don't have just a single, let's say, team of people in one silo sticking there, always opposing, which was not the case in Montreal. As long as this is the case, I think we are on a good track. So I think that's how it is. I mean, it's about, in the end, it's about people negotiating something and also having the kind of, let's say, agenda from home, the kind of message, the kind of idea they bring into the meeting. And then they have to find out what is the best way to achieve most of it, but you never can achieve all of it. So I think it was a normal, or let's say even more positive atmosphere. That was my impression in Montreal. Maybe it's also because we have, that's another topic, of course, we have more young people included, or maybe it's just because I'm getting older. Maybe that's also one reason. So people are getting younger relative to me, which means maybe they're still the same age, you don't know. But I had lots of, let's say, refreshing interactions with all the youth delegates, for example, in this meeting. Like I guess they also make a difference in such an, let's say, negotiation marathon, I would say. So I think, yes, it's similar, but it was better than the other ones. And it's normal to have alliances for different topics because you have to push your way through. You have to get, let's say, your friends who support you, and then you achieve something.
We also have had the discussion about the third pillar of this debates and discussions and of these negotiations at the end, and this is about how to finance biodiversity and the alignment of financial flows with nature to drive finances towards sustainable investments and away from environmental harmful ones. What steps have been achieved here, Simangele? Maybe you start, and I'm also interested in the opinion of Josef.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I'll build on what I had just said earlier. Is that so? For instance, there was wide recognition that assessing finances from the Global Environmental Facility can be a cumbersome process. and so on. So one of the proposals that it came from Africa was the establishment of the Global Biodiversity Fund. The current decision does recognize the need for that fund because, of course, articles of the convention do mention anyway that the convention need a financing mechanism. But the decision that's being taken for now is that in the meantime, you are going to have a GBF trust fund, because it will take longer to develop the Global Biodiversity Fund. So to some extent, it is moving in the right direction. But this is a discussion we've been having for the last, 4 years, in 2018 when negotiations started. So for us to only realize in 2022 that let's do the trust fund before we do the Global Biodiversity Fund, we could have done better. So those measures have been taken to place, I would say at a pace of a very slow pace, but it is taking place. One of the things, however, that was concerning for me, if you look at the target for resource mobilization, it does also identify some of the innovative schemes for generating financial resources, and you have biodiversity offsets there. I'm, of course, one of the people who's of the belief that the ecosystem services and actually functions are not interchangeable. You cannot degrade in one side under the promise of, well, I will protect something else in another side as long as I can pay for something. It just sounds like a system that revolves on money, that as long as other people or institutions have money, can get away with degrading ecosystems. But I would say largely there was a bit of movement with the discussion of the trust fund. But also, secondly, one of the things that Africa was pushing for in that target was a clear language that mentions that developed countries must commit to some resources in line with Article 20 of the convention. So you do see that text also in the target, and there is a specific figure that has been, of course, proposed. Of course, for now, all of these numbers fall short of closing the biodiversity financing gap that is estimated at $700 billion. But I guess they are better than nothing, right? I even feel negative because we are at the point where we are saying it's better than before, but it's still not good enough. So I do think there were some gains made in the context of the Biodiversity Fund, in the context of developed countries being responsible for significantly increasing financial flows for conservation. But me personally concerned with biodiversity offsets being one of the things that are being strategically mentioned as innovative schemes for resource mobilization.
Josef?
Yeah, well, I was surprised in the end that this 20 billion was the thing you had agreed on, actually. I would have expected it could have been higher, of course. You would agree, Simangele, I think. So that's something I didn't follow in the last days, because before we had the discussion in the plenary last Saturday the week before, where it was this kind of Brazil on behalf of many other countries saying it's 100 billion, something like this you want to go for. So it's still a big gap there. So it seems there is some kind of, let's say, consensus that it moves in the right direction, and we have to increase this. So 20 billion, that's okay. It's surely by far not enough. It's just really a kind of starting point to establish the principle behind. And I guess having this kind of fund in perspective, maybe it's a good approach to do this in the next 2 years until the next COP. I think that's the plan as far as I understood. I think it's not perfect, but it's a good move. I would have expected at least to come up with 50 billion or something from my kind of feeling, no? So 20 is okay. If you take Germany as 1.5 already, so it's quite good compared to the others, but it's only relatively good in comparison. Absolutely, it's still, well, if you take, for example, our big kind of, let's say, catastrophe last year, the R flooding, which cost 30 billion euro for a small valley in central Germany or Western Germany. Well, compared to this, 20 billion for the global biodiversity is nothing. No, it's really nothing. So there's still a long way to go. So here I was surprised that this was the kind of, let's say, outcome. And I think it was a compromise where I think many states, including yours, Simangele, have kind of, let's say, swallowed quite a bit, I could imagine. No? So it's good it's there. I am surprised it's that low. But at least, as you said, we are moving in the right direction. But here there has to be a lot of improvement. And of course, you have to find ways how to really also get the money on the ground. And that's something I don't know what's in the moment. Maybe you know, Simangele, how you get this really on the ground besides the big companies and the nations, how you can get it on place. I think that's still very open, isn't it?
Yeah, that's still definitely very open.
And my question, like additional to what you've said, would be, what is your opinion on so-called nature carbon credits, nature positive financing? This is, as far as I see, it's more than a trend, by the way. It's a way of trying to really financing our basic resources as a commodity, so to say, nature to finance as a commodity. Is that the way you would say, which is the right one?
So if you ask me, because Simangele already said something on about this, well, I think it could only be one component of the entire picture. For me, it's always very hard to put values on certain, let's say, services or certain functions or on certain species. That's something that's very hard to do. Sometimes it might be justified just to, let's say, bring across what it really means economically for us. If you take the value of pollination globally up to $600 billion per year, something like this, it's a kind of figure which helps you quite a lot in terms of, let's say, imagine what you just, let's say, take for granted, which is not necessarily granted. So that's something where you would use monetary values. For the whole offsetting, I'm a bit torn in between. I have not my own personal decision. I just have a kind of, let's say, uneasy feeling if it goes down to, let's say, putting dollars or yuan or something like this on certain services. It might be a way to, let's say, at least get some more of these aspects into our economic thinking. But I think if we think that's the only solution, then we are lost, because then we are too much commercializing the entire issue. That's more or less my view on this.
Thank you. Ingelor? You're on mute, Ingelor.
I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Simangele, you are a big advocate for professional opportunities for the youth and the engagement at the CBD. How impactful was the use these decision-making platforms at the CBD 15 this year? And how can we further ensure that this impact of the youth can be transferred into implementation?
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I mean, youth were very impactful, and this is largely due to the great coordination by the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, GIBIN in short, which is the official youth constituency to the CBD. So GIBIN currently has chapters in a lot of countries. In Africa, they're active in more than 20 countries, and they really made efforts to ensure that from each of those established chapters, they bring at least one person. So that was great to see. I do know that also other organizations brought youth in their delegation. South Africa, for example, had 6 young people in their delegation. In our team as the African Wildlife Foundation, we also had 6 youth in our delegation who are part of a leadership program that I also oversee and so on. So I think it was really inspiring to see that governments and organizations are starting to add youth in their delegations and so on, and are also involving them as part of the preparatory processes. But apart from just the numbers, I would say what was also even more great was the actual content and experience that youth bring. Because for a lot of these organizations, it's not a matter of just you bring numbers and come chill in our side events, but they're actually trained on how the process works. These young people have been contributing in the consultation meetings in their own countries. They've been participating in meetings such as the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, which set priorities for Africa coming here, and also are able to write real interventions to be read either during plenaries or in contact group. And I'll say, so it was impactful, but it's largely due to the investment that a lot of organizations are bringing, not only to just bring people as numbers, but to invest in the actual professional development of those young people. And I think this is something that needs to continue to ensure that these youth can contribute into NBSUBs, but also to ensure that they are able to go back and train other youth Yeah, because I always say being youth is an interesting one, because, you know, unlike being a woman, where I can just be a woman until I die, even if you don't want to not be youth anymore, you can't stay as youth. Yeah, even if you want to be youth forever, you can't. So it's an age where it's critical that we develop you, but it's also an age where you as a young person needs to start thinking sustainability, and that means training others and so on. So I look forward to continue engaging with partners in how we build the capacity of youth. At the African Wildlife Foundation, we have a program where every year we'll be onboarding 15 young people, train them on the process, help them write policy briefs, take them here, and we are doing that with other partners like UNEP and so on. So there is a growing movement of institutions that are interested in this kind of work. Joseph, we're also trying to train youth to follow the EPS process so that they also adequately understand the science side of things and how the science is contributing into the CBD process. So I'll say there's great improvement, but really acknowledging the institutions behind this improvement, being the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, as well as all the other. I know I've only mentioned the countries from Africa that brought, I mean, we always know the Nordic Council brings the youth delegation. Canada has also consistently been bringing youth delegates, even in the past meetings of OEWG and so on. A lot of countries are doing it. I hope those who are not doing it yet take it from this good example. And I look forward to how it all works out in the future. I mean, I think I will close on that question by saying, for me, I always say conservation and sustainable development is an intergenerational mission. You can never solve, even if you are restoring a forest, it can never be fully functional within just one person's lifetime, and so on. So it being an intergenerational mission means its success really relies on our ability to ensure that the next generation of leaders are up to the task of taking over. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Simangele. And Joseph, in your circle, what was your take on the youth and their impact there?
Well, I think it was quite impactful. If I take some examples, we had some of our German delegation members who are youth representatives, but also business and biodiversity linked. There are two of them at least have been in Montreal, have been quite active. So combining youth and combining a new view on business, which I think is a really great combination, actually. So that's something I really appreciate. And as Simangele has mentioned IPBES, well, we have this fellowship program in IPBES, which enables young people to really, let's say, learn about the process, experience the process of doing this kind of assessments, which is another important component in order to build the next generation. The generation we all work for, actually, in the end, the next and beyond this. Now we are thinking about generations, otherwise it doesn't work. If you just think about ourselves, okay, why should I care? I will just live for another 20 years if I'm happy, and that's it. So it's a thing of responsibility for the next generations to come. And I think that's why we have to have the youth component in there as early as possible, and also guarantee, let's say, this kind of education, this kind of experience exchange, just to let's say, learn from the experience we had so far and make things better in the future. That would be something. Sounds like from the church now, but I think that's really what I think. I really believe in that.
Yeah, but it's good. I think it's good to point it out. And coming now to look forward, what are, from your both points of view, what are the next steps to become now?
Well, if I start, I would say the natural biodiversity strategy and action plans and NBSAPs is surely an important entry point, which is the thing where you bring things down to the ground on a national scale. And there you can see who really is committed and who really maybe is not committed to this kind of activities. And then we can see which statements have to be taken serious from Montreal and which ones have been, let's say, more lip service. That's something which we have to see. So I hope that many countries really have an ambitious NBSAP to really implement in their national, let's say, territory. And that's something, well, we have to follow this. And the other thing, well, from a scientific point of view, of course, we always try to watch what's going on. We always try to see what's happening. We also try to, let's say, bring in new insights if there are, and also see how policy relevant these are. That's another point which is kind of our mantra in IPBES and IPCC, to be policy relevant but not prescriptive, which is not always trivial. If you have a certain opinion yourself, how to frame it in a way which doesn't really prescribe to the politicians what to do, but at least gives them maybe a limited set of options which go in a direction which is positive for the nature, which is already prescriptive to some extent, but a bit more subtle. So that's would be my role, or our role as scientists, to follow the process and to accompany, also to show it things which might look good, but maybe not very good. If you look for the nature-based solution is one of the topics. So in the assessment of IPBES and IPCC, we highlighted, and also IPC has highlighted later, this kind of, let's say, difficulty or problem in having monocultures for biofuel generation. It's corn or it's forest. So if it's monocrop kind of approaches, in the end, really don't pay off. They're really negative for the entire, let's say, SDG achievements. So these are things which looks good because you save some kind of, you seem to save carbon for the climate component. But in the end, if you go the whole thing through, also financially, it's not the case. So this kind of examples is something we have to watch to see that not all directions that look promising are really promising. To really have the foundation in the background to really pin down numbers. What does measure ABC really mean in terms of finances, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate? So that's something I think is our task also for the future.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say on my side, linked to your national biodiversity strategy and action plans, the next big thing that I think is important are the national finance plans. We do at a national level need this clarity of how much it would take to implement whatever we commit to and where that money will come from, how much of it are we getting domestically, and how much of it is going to come from the currently disappointing pot, right? That was pledged at the summit. But just to add, yes, national biodiversity strategy and action plans, as well as the national finance plans.
Before we come to an end, I would like to ask you a final question, more generally spoken. Why would you say, you both, you who are for a long time now in the conservation business, in the conservation scene, why is it so hard that we protect where we are based on, that we protect sustainably where we are based on? Why is it so difficult? And I know it's more or less a philosophical question, but I wonder whether you have an answer on that. Josef.
So, well, we often talk about this keyword mainstreaming. I think that's exactly what it's all about. The knowledge on this dependency still has not yet penetrated the society. I think that's one important component. That's why we try, at least I try, many of my colleagues try to bring across messages in a kind of, let's say, simplified way. So take the pollination is a good example. Of course, everybody loves pollinators. It's a good entry point. Everybody likes bees. It's positive, much easier than stinging midges, for example. So if you take this pollination example, you can see, well, how much we depend on this is in terms of vitamins, in terms of nutrients. So all vitamins are coming from fruits which depend on pollination. So our own, let's say, food, the quality, not the quantity, but the quality of food depends on this very much. So that's one entry point where you can show what biodiversity really means. And then this is one point where you can bring across what is in there for us, why we need it, why are we dependent. You could do the same with pandemics like COVID, which is closely linked to the destruction of nature in certain areas, which then creates this kind of, let's say, conditions where certain pathogens can really easily thrive and evolve and then eventually jump over to humans. It's also closely linked to the diversity of systems. So bringing across this idea of diversities. I'll take another example. Back home in our place, where I'm living right now, that's a Harz mountain, which is just one coniferous plant, which is now eaten by some bark beetles. Well, it's just a matter of, let's say, having this monoculture, which is not really resilient against any kinds of new development like climate change. So here again, you have this kind of biodiversity aspect, diversity of tree species, which will help you a lot in maintaining forests, sequestering carbon, and also keeping biodiversity alive. So these kind of real-world examples from from the specific surroundings of people is, I think, quite an important entry point. And then, of course, taking people on board. So one thing I observed oftentimes in Central Europe, at least, is that, for example, farmers are, somehow put on the corner as kind of being the enemy of biodiversity, which is not the case, because they are the custodians actually of biodiversity. They made food available for all of us. So what they did is using biodiversity to make a better life for us. Of course, they are also the reason for some declines, because intensification is a problem, the lack of agroecology, all these kind of things. But I guess bringing across this details, these stories, is an important component in mainstreaming. I think it's all about mainstreaming. And it's not so easy for people to experience biodiversity in a strict sense than it is to experience climate change. If it's getting drought or dry or too wet, it's much easier. That's, I think, one of the reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll build into that as well, that other people don't understand how they benefit from it, but also some folk could be benefiting more from it. And this is why, for me, coming here, ensuring that sustainable use was reflected in this framework was a major thing for me. I keep on going back to the model of conservation that we've had in sub-Saharan Africa, where it was very excluding people. So people were like, you have these conservation areas, but we are not benefiting, but other people are making money out of them. So I really think ensuring that people benefit and see the real tangible benefit from conservation is one of the ways to actually encourage them and ensure that they play a role as custodians. I was saying I'm happy. I was using the terminology that the framework is reigning sustainable use, something that was lacking in the previous framework, which traditionally just focused on the conservation parts with solidly to do with benefit sharing or with sustainable use. But this time around, you have sustainable use reflected in the famous/infamous target 3. You have it reflected in target 5, in target 9, and so on. So ensuring that people really benefit from nature is one of the ways to, so that they have this incentive for continuing to protect nature.
Yeah, and thank you so much for both of you and your thoughts. This is the 21st edition of Africa Talks on the topic, we have a declaration, World Nature Conference COP15 agrees on protecting biodiversity sustainably. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. A big shout out to our 2 experts, Josef and Simangele. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much also from my side to both of you. I think we learned a lot. And I think this is also important when we need to communicate about the benefits of nature, about that it's not a cost factor, but that it is a real asset, so to say. And I think this was a little small step on bringing more knowledge and expertise in the discussion. Thank you for that, and thank you very much for that, Josef and Simangele. I can and I might say already next year we will come back with another edition of Africa Talks, and then we really focus on biodiversity financing. How can we use the new mechanisms like bio-nature credits to fund conservation, especially in terms of rewarding nature stewards living every day with this biodiversity and carrying that cost? I think that's also that will be also a very interesting and exciting discussion. Looking forward to that with experts again from conservation and civil society. But for now, I'm very grateful. Goodbye to all of you. Take care, stay healthy. Happy Christmas and a good start in 2023. I think you all, especially you guys, have deserved it after a hard 2 weeks of negotiating. Hope to see you again in 2023. Enjoy your holidays. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks.